hit that like button and subscribe.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're talking about divorce. You know, it's a topic that we all think we know, and it's usually dominated by one single massive statistic. But what if that number, and a lot of our assumptions about divorce, are just plain wrong? Let's dig into the real data. All right, let's just dive right in with what's got to be one of the most famous, or maybe infamous, stats of all time. I mean, you've heard it a million times, right? Half of all marriages end in divorce. It's a number that has cast a shadow over relationships for decades. But here's the question. Is it even true anymore? So that 50% number? Yeah, it's not just a little off. It's basically telling the wrong story entirely. The reality is the overall divorce rate in general has actually been falling for years. It is not a 50-50 coin toss. So where did that number even come from, and what's the real story?
Okay, so here's a much more accurate number. For a first marriage, the actual risk of divorce is closer to 41%. But here's the kicker. That risk is not the same for everyone. If you've been divorced once, the risk for your second marriage, it jumps to 60%. And for a third, a staggering 73%. See, that old 50% stat was just lumping all of this together and giving us a really muddy picture.
Okay, so if the overall rate is actually going down, who's left? I mean, who is actually getting divorced these days? Well, when we start to dig into the demographics, the data reveals some incredibly consistent and kind of surprising patterns. Let's get into it.
Wow. Okay, this is one of the most striking patterns you'll see in the data. It's the gender divide and who actually files for divorce. And it is overwhelmingly women. We're talking about 2/3 of all cases, on average. In some studies, that number has even climbed closer to 75%.
And get this, it turns out your job might be a surprisingly strong predictor of whether you'll stay married. Just look at this split. On one side, you've got dancers, bartenders, massage therapists. Their rates are all hovering up around 40%. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, agricultural engineers. Their divorce rate is less than 2%. What a difference.
And these patterns don't stop there. They pop up again when we look at politics and especially money. People who identify as liberal report higher rates of divorce, but the economic divide is even starker. I mean, look at this. People earning less than 20 grand a year are getting divorced at almost twice the rate of those making over 75,000. That's a huge gap, and it suggests financial stress and marital stress are deeply, deeply connected.
All right, so that's the who. But what about the why? I mean, what are the actual reasons people give when their marriage falls apart? When researchers ask them, what do they say?
So you'd probably guess that things like cheating or constant fighting would be at the very top of the list, right? And yeah, they're up there. But the number one reason, by a long shot, cited by nearly 3/4 of people, a lack of commitment. It tells us that for most couples, it's not so much a big, dramatic explosion. It's more like a slow drift apart.
Of course, a divorce isn't just about the two people in the couple. For millions of families, it's about the kids. And honestly, this is where the research paints its most serious and concerning picture, revealing some really clear long-term consequences.
This quote comes from a massive landmark study by the U.S. Census Bureau. We're talking about data from 5 million children. They linked tax records, census records, everything they could get their hands on to track outcomes over time. And their conclusion? It's crystal clear. Divorce is a huge and often negative turning point in a child's life with effects that ripple out for decades.
So what do they find? A direct link. The younger a child is when their parents split, the bigger the financial hit they take as an adult. For a kid whose parents divorce in early childhood, we're talking about a potential adult income cut of nearly 10%. And they're also way less likely to have that classic on-campus college experience.
And it's not just about money in school. The impact stretches into life and health, literally. Look at this. A 35 to 55% increase in a child's mortality risk over their lifetime. And the chance of a teen birth? It skyrockets by 73%. These are not small statistical blips. These are profound, life-altering impacts.
Okay, so just when you think you have the picture figured out, divorce rates are generally going down. A really fascinating counter-trend pops up, and it's happening among older Americans, completely changing the landscape for an entire generation. They're calling it gray divorce, and wow, does it stand out from the overall picture. For people 65 and older, the divorce rate has actually tripled since the 1990s. Tripled! It's the fastest growing group for divorce, hands down. So why is this happening? What's going on here? Well, researchers point to a few big societal shifts. First, we're all living longer, and people just aren't as willing to spend their golden years in an unhappy marriage. Second, women today often have way more economic independence, which gives them the freedom to leave. And finally, once the kids are grown and out of the house, that social pressure to stay together, fertile children, just isn't as strong.
All right, let's take a breath. We've covered a ton of ground here, right? We've busted the 50% myth, we've looked at the tough data on kids, and we've seen this surprising rise of gray divorce. So, let's try to pull it all together and figure out what it all means.
So, let's just toss that old 50% myth in the trash. What's the real story of divorce today? Here it is. First, the overall rate is falling, but it's complicated. Second, demographics are huge predictors, especially who initiates it and how much money you make. Third, the consequences for children are severe and scientifically documented. And fourth, there's a quiet revolution happening among older adults that is totally reshaping retirement.
You know, looking at all this data, we get a much sharper picture of what divorce looks like right now. But it also leaves us with this really big question for the future. As we all live longer, as women gain more economic autonomy, and as social norms just keep shifting, the very definition of a lifelong partnership is being put to the test. What does that mean for the future of the family? Well, that's something the data will continue to reveal.
Oh, hit the like button and subscribe. And hit that damn bell.